Welcome to our colleagues and friends who are online, who are watching us online. A very important note, if you're watching live stream and you have a question, because this is a conversation, a dialogue, you must go to menti.com and use the code 19644108 in order to join the conversation. And my co-Jennifer here will be moderating the online questions, but welcome everyone. A little bit about myself. I was born in the US. My family and my ancestors all come from Suriname. So I have a lot of roots here in the Netherlands. 4 generations of my family come out of the Netherlands, in Suriname, of course. I was the first generation born in the United States. I've been living here and working in the Netherlands for the last 10 years. Nederlands is zo-zo. Ja, begrijp je goed, maar Engels is mijn eerste taal. So thanks for that we'll be doing this in English this evening. And I am a cultural historian. I'm also a descendant. I consider myself an activist, an epistemical activist, a cultural activist. I started the Black Heritage Tours in Amsterdam. Some of you might have been on the tour or know me from the tours in 2013. And I've co-written 3 books on Amsterdam, Netherlands, and Dutch New York heritage and slavery heritage. And I'm working tirelessly on a double master's in heritage and memory. So I'm very focused on material heritage, immaterial heritage, also how it links to our collective memories. So it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening and to moderate this conversation. We are here at the Stadium General event, which is organized in collaboration with cultural manifestation Bitterzoet Erfgoed. And we will be talking about colonial collections, which is, for me and my work, very interesting. And I am always discussing these conversations in the museum context, because I do work in the museums, research tours as well in the museums. But the Netherlands as a nation has been struggling with its colonial collections for a very long time now, and which objects of colonial origin are in the collections of Dutch museums, and how do they end up there? Should we send them back? What kind of stories do they tell? And what is our responsibility as a society in reflecting upon these questions? Here and in other countries, since October of 2020, I'm going to really screw this up. Gonçalves, how did I do? Committee advised the Minister van Engelshoven to return the objects looted from former Dutch colonies. Objects of great cultural value that have been demonstrably stolen should have been returned by the state, owner that have much been debated about these artifacts. One of the challenges that has been facing these reconciliations is the countries or communities that once owned the objects or where they originated from. Oftentimes we don't know where these items are located in the Netherlands or where they originated from outside of the Netherlands. In fact, some of our museums have a very poor overview of their origins, their collections, or don't know how to handle what they have in their storage. Several members of our audience tonight are working on these very complex issues as we speak, among which the steering committee of the Bitterzoet Erfgoed. I would just like to see the hands of the Bitterzoet Erfgoed committee. Wonderful. Great to have you here. And we will be talking about what's coming up with that project. Also, we're looking into discussing matters, several museum directors who are here. Any other museum directors from the Groningen Museum? Also here. Wonderful. I knew you were there. Great. We'll be in this discussion, so we're looking forward to engaging you in the conversation as well. And our guests this evening will be, on my left is Raul Balai and Suzanne Legend. I have to say, we are very sorry that Wayne Modest, who was originally included in the program, had a family urgency. We won't call it an emergency, but he was unable to attend. And we're really appreciative that Raul could step in at this last minute to engage us. And I know it will be a very interesting conversation with Raul. So without further ado, shall we begin? Great. So I first want to introduce Raul. And I'm going to include some slides because for many of you may not know Raul, and I think it's important that we contextualize the work that he's been doing for the last several years in museums, and how important I think to this conversation Raul will be. Raul works as a designer, an exhibition maker, a curator, an artist. He hates that I call him an activist, but I see him that way too. Based on fascination for historiography and diversity, in his work is about providing insight into power structures, how they resonate in the way this story of history is told and reproduced, and how they lead to the society we have today. Now that sounds great, but to really understand Raul and his work, you have to see it. It's very visual. And this is just some snapshots of exhibitions that Raul has done in institutional spaces, also non-so-called traditional institutional spaces. This is an exhibition from the Gouden Koets tentoonstelling in the Amsterdam Museum. It doesn't do it justice because you really can't see the close-up and how Raul has subverted some of these very colonial symbols into telling a different story. Then there's also the Zwart in Rembrandt's tijd, which was a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic actually hit. This exhibition was at the Rembrandt House Museum. There's me in the corner in my usual debating, discussing self. Did any of you see this exhibition at the Rembrandt House? No, it's a shame. It's still, you can see elements of it still online. There's also the video as well. It's like a 10-minute video. I think it's very interesting. And what I loved about these images is it shows the dialogue. That what is most important about, I think, the work that really for me resonates is that Raul's work always inspires and invokes a conversation. Not always easy conversations, but always a conversation that should invoke something that we haven't already thought about, questioning, discussing, agreeing, but not always. And this is another exhibition that was in which? CBK Zuidoost. This is from the same exhibition, right? And this was from the Stadsarchief in Amsterdam, which was a very provocative exhibition. Was it suiker?
Yeah, it's called Sugar Free. Sugar
Free. And using these models that were cast with sugar. We don't have the video, though, of how you poured liquid sugar on top of them or water.
There's also a video on my website.
There's a video on the website for Raul Balai, and the conversation that it invoked was quite provocative, I think, as well. There you see him pouring the water, the colored water on the object and melting, basically.
It's liquor.
It's liquor. Oh, is it Geneva?
It's blue curacao.
Blue. Oh, see, I didn't know that.
It's totally colonial.
Totally colonial. And the rood and the groen, what? Those.
It's just different. There's Geneva in the non-colored one.
Okay.
And there's a strawberry in the other one.
Oh, interesting.
But it's all sugar-based.
Okay.
I think my mic is not on.
Oh, yes, we don't hear you. Another exhibition was at the Black Archives, Black and Revolutionary as well. So that's just a little taste of Raul's work. Next, I'd like to introduce Suzanne. Would you come back to the podium here? Suzanne Legend is the Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Professor of Political History at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, with a special interest in colonial and post-colonial studies related to issues of power dynamics in cultural spaces. In the past, she worked at the Royal Tropical Institute, the Tropo Museum. Moreover, she was a member of the National Nederlands Committee for UNESCO and is the co-chair with Wayne for Pressing Matters, which is a research project. Hopefully, you will learn more about if you don't already know. Welcome to both Suzanne and to Raul. Come on. Yes. And I do have an image here, Suzanne, which is really interesting, but I have no idea what it means. So maybe you can help us to contextualize the work that you're doing in this space around material heritage and artifacts and objects, and how this image relates to that.
Yeah. Is my mic working?
Can you all hear? No, if not, then we...
It was.
It was working.
Yes.
Ah, there it is.
It does, so I have to put it in another way, maybe.
Sorry. There you go. Try to stop now.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we hear you.
Well, I was asked to bring one picture, and actually I asked, can't we also have an object? So we will discuss the
Yes.
object later. But the picture is indeed a drawing which draws from many different objects. So in a way it takes fragments, ornaments from different objects, and together, in a way, it also symbolizes the problem that we are dealing with when we talk about colonial collections, because the guy who made this, he is a South African designer, and he made the style for our project. And in order to immerse himself... Nee? Oh.
Should we just use...
Zet hem op mijn bril.
In het midden? Ik denk, jullie, achterin, jullie zijn mijn testpersonen. Suzanne?
Ja, is dit beter? Anders hou ik hem in de hand.
Or just use this.
Ik hou hem in mijn hand.
Soft-spoken.
Oh ja, nu merk ik het. Ja, oké. So it's a compilation based on objects that were used as illustrations in that report that you also mentioned concerning restitution of cultural objects. And actually in that report, one doesn't speak about stolen objects, as you said, but about involuntary separated.
Involuntary separated.
Yeah, so that's the euphemism of saying that in a way these objects have come here, those from where it came maybe were not involved in handing over in various ways. So this drawing is, well, for us it is the starting point of the Pressing Matter project.
And why? And I was curious about the name. Why Pressing Matters? How did that
Matter.
name? Pressing
Pressing
matter.
matter. So it's about in a way it refers to, of course, matter, objects, material culture.
Mm-hmm.
It refers to urgency. What are we? It's pressing. It's haunting. So what are we doing with it actually? And it also indicates that, in a way, we should not lose time for searching for solutions with these collections, because it's not just that we can think about it and make up our mind and decide. Others also say we need those objects.
Yeah.
So for them it's urgent as well.
And the research project, which goes from 2020 to 2025, is the focus on what we have here as an example, the CRIS, is exploring objects at museums and private collections, and what their origins are. What is the sort of briefly, the scope of the project?
Yeah, let me briefly explain. So it is a huge project. We got money from the Dutch Science Agenda, the Nederlandse Wetenschapsagenda, and that's a collaboration in order to solve societal problems. So this issue has been acknowledged as a societal problem. It's a collaboration between 5 universities and one institute, a NIOD, 8 museums, partly combined in the Stichting Academisch Erfgoed, the Foundation for Academic Heritage, where the Gronings Universiteitsmuseum also is part of, and that's why also the Gronings Universiteitsmuseum is part of it. But also, for instance, Bronbeek, a museum which is owned by the Ministry of Defense and which actually is rooted in the colonial army, the KNIL, is a partner. Other university museums like Museum Vrolijk in Amsterdam AMC, which has huge collections of human remains, but also other scientific. And then, of course, the National Museum of World Cultures as one of the partners, and Rijksmuseum as one of the other partners. So it's huge, but there is also commitment as from the very start with activists. And I saw that you introduced yourself as an epistemical activist. I thought, wow.
Yeah, because in my work, I'm really confronting language and how language is used, how narratives have been framed around the colonial past, memory, of course, as it connects to identity. And so I do also, will carry a sign if I'm in a protest movement. But for me, the spaces that I really see my work have the influence is in the academy, is in cultural spaces, in museum spaces. So it's kind of a way to use that language that can be relatable for some.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for the explanation. And indeed, what we are discussing in our project is that not all objects came in our museum collections in the same way. So some have been traded, some have been collected in the context of scientific work, some have been collected in the context of missionary work, conversion. Some have been created in a kind of cultural get-together, and some, or maybe in the end, every object has been brought to the Netherlands in a context of violence, because the colonial past was basically a system based in violence. So we want to look at those different modes of collecting: trade, conversion, co-creation, scientific research, war, and war booty. Those 5 ways of collecting. And we want to see what, in the end, defines the object. So is it how it has been acquired? Is it what we know about objects the moment it entered the museum? Is it what we know about the collector? Or is it a direct relationship with communities from where it came? And what does it tell us today, what those objects mean for communities today, and whether or not they should be returned? So one of the things, and then I will end, one of the things that we thought about that political report or that advice from the Raad van Cultuur, which said, of course, stolen objects have to be returned. One of the things that we say is, it's not so easy to make a distinction between what was stolen and what is not stolen, but traded or given away or whatever. But B, what does it mean to give it back? That's not just easy. You cannot say, okay, Tropo Museum has some 3,000 human remains. We put them in a box and we send them to Indonesia. That's not how you can restitute. So we say, okay, there are things that are requested to return. There are things that nobody knows value and they have to be valued again. There are things that we thought that we knew what it meant, but actually we now find out that we don't know at all. And that's all the thinking that we want to do. And it's not just thinking, but in the end we will also come with guidelines and teaching materials and concrete proposals for dealing with restitution.
So direct action at the end of it would be an outcome. Return.
I hope not only at the end of it, but as part of the process.
So we're going to come back to the questions about also, because you did mention human remains are included, but I want to bring Raul you into this conversation, because the work that you do in institutional museums like Scheepvaart and Rijksmuseum, Amsterdam Museum, how is that usually you're introduced to a project? Is it to look at these contested objects and paintings and create a counter-narrative? Could you talk a little bit about your process in working with museums over the last several years?
Well, it really depends on the question of the institute. because I play so many different roles as a curator or as an artist. I don't think this mic is really. Can I have yours? Maybe it's a lot easier. It's okay. So it depends on the question of the institute, actually. Sometimes I'm asked as a curator, sometimes I'm asked as an artist, and that's for me a big difference. I'm also a designer, so sometimes I enter as an exhibition designer, or that's the question, but then I make clear that I don't want to be just an exhibition designer because that's not the way I work. I want to have partially at least control of the story that's being told. I think the Rembrandt Museum is a very good case where you can see that they asked me as an exhibition designer and conceptual advisor, and pretty soon it became really clear that the way they were telling the story about black people in Rembrandt's age was actually leading it back to the dominant Eurocentric narrative. So I was working on it together with Brian Elstock. Some of you might know him as an artist. And we just took it completely apart. So the first presentation we had with the museum, they were really confused because we took them through a presentation of, I think, 150 or 160 slides and just tore it apart. So that's a really interesting process. And I think in the process with the Rembrandt Museum, that was an institution that was really willing to change. So the team was really open to look at the stuff differently. Some things weren't possible because they asked us really late in their process. They were working for 5 years on this exhibition and asked us 18 months before the opening. So this is also something that institutes have to learn. Like if you want to work with someone like me with a certain expertise and a certain connection to a subject, you will have to include people in a really early stage. But in the case of the Rijksmuseum, I was on a think tank. So that's a really different role. And in the case of the Gouden Koets tentoonstelling, which is still on till the end of the month, so if you have the chance to go to Amsterdam, go have a look, because it's really, I think also really a good exhibition to see how the construct of the Dutch royals influences Dutch society. And I think that's really important to understand when you look at colonialism as well, the role they played, the role Willem III played, when you look at the Nederlandse Handelsbank, how that came forth out of the East India Company, and how that in the end became the ABN AMRO Bank. You know, it's this kind of information that's really triggering to me, and what I did within the Gouden Koets tentoonstelling, I was there as an artist. So I just try to move away from the object and make it more about citizenship, because I'm not so much interested in this object. Because the coach is the coach. If you put it in front of, or if you put horses in front of it, it moves. But if there are no horses in front of it, it's dead. It's a dead object. And I think I'm past the point of being really upset about this one panel. I think you shouldn't ride the coach anymore in public space, maybe in your own garden if you're the king. But so that becomes a more important conversation to me, like the society we are today. Who has a say in where we are taking this conversation? And I think that's also really interesting in the process you're going into. It's like all the questions and the different parts you're looking at. And I'm like, yes, there are some issues with getting to know where it should be returned to. And there are some issues about how to return it. But if you ask me, it's a really simple question. It's not a Dutch object. And trade and all these kind of euphemisms. I mean, you already said, like, it's all in this context of violence, right? So how willingly is this traded? Like, if I put a knife to your neck and I say, like, let's trade your bracelet for my phone, and then we traded it, but did we really?
Was it a fair trade? The questions. But this is a good point, and I want to come back to the question of language and how important this also in terms of how we're framing this discussion. Because you mentioned, Suzanne, that included in the scope of the project, the research, is also human remains, which brings into a whole nother dynamic. You mentioned that the Tropo Museum has up to 3,000 still human remains. There are other museums, like I know I was doing a project in Bremen in Germany, where there's still thousands of human remains from the people from Namibia that researchers and scientists can still go to these institutes and request to study these objects, these human remains. I don't know if that's a case where it can be done also at the Tropo, but how then do you engage in a conversation? I mean, there's certainly a lot of scientific technology that can trace the origins of human remains, but how does that differ in terms of the conversation or the debate?
Yeah. If you allow me to indeed talk more about human remains in the Tropo Museum, because I have been working on that since 2000.
Promise not to cut you off. I promise. Go ahead. I'm also keeping time as well, so just keep it brief.
Those remains cannot be studied. So they have been documented as far as we could document them, and they are in boxes, and the boxes cannot be opened. So they are there in order to discuss with the people from where it came what to do with it. And of course, there were many options. They might be useful for science, because you could have DNA research in pathogen DNA to see why did the people die, because it's hospital. So maybe we know more about what happened to malaria or whatever. So there are many exciting questions that people might ask, but the conclusion was it is not ethical to use these remains at all, and science in itself is not an argument to say, okay, and that's why we want to have access to them. We are not supposed to control who has access. They are just not accessible, and we are discussing what to do with it.
So do you treat the remains in a very different way than in the discussions, for example, with objects like the Chris?
Well, you know, the human remains seem to be clear. That's about body parts of people. But then you have a whole scale. Where does a human remain stop and where does an object start? So, for instance, a photograph or facial masks. In our project, we will work on the facial masks from NIAS. They are now on display in the Rijksmuseum, some of them, in a corner directly close to where concentration camps and Holocaust is being discussed, in the context of physical anthropology and thinking about race. But we doubt whether these masks can serve that purpose. So we talk with people in NIAS, and that's part of the project, who recognize people, who know who were the people whose face was being casted. And we think with them, and the museum that owns it, which is the Utrecht Universiteitsmuseum, they say, okay, we make copies and we send them the copies. But we say, first, who gives you permission to make a copy? Second, why should they have the copy and we keep the original? Moreover, it's a cast, so what's original and what's copy? It is already from a mold. It's one example, but you can continue. You can say, okay, there are many objects in which body parts, body parts are part of it, like ancestor sculptures with a skull in it, or like knives made from bones. But then there are also, of course, clothes that people wear on their body. And some of those clothes, we know they were taken when people were taken prisoner or when they were killed. So there is blood on it, or there's a history of blood on it.
So it's very complicated, in other words.
But I don't want to complicate everything, because someone also said to us, don't complicate in order not
the reason I say
take a
that
decision.
is because it often, as Raul said, it seems simple. Here's objects that have an origin that did not come from the Netherlands, that would seem logical or rational that if we know the origin, that they should be returned. human remains, it makes it more difficult to do that, given that oftentimes we don't know who the ancestors are or who they represent. But I guess the deeper question becomes the outcomes. While the outcome is it to return ultimately the objects that we do know, for example, the kris that was returned to Indonesia a couple of years ago. King Willem-Alexander was there to make this very official ceremony. We have a kris here that's from the Groningen Museum. No, from the University Museum. Do we know, can you share something about what we know of this kris and its origins?
Yeah.
Is that...
Yeah. One final remark about the human remains.
Yes.
We have been returning human remains to Suriname that were excavated at the Quataweg. So they were returned because the people there said, we do want those objects. But you cannot just send them because
understood.
It's uneasy for us to have them.
Yeah.
And that's another type of responsibility.
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood.
Okay, can we go to the kris?
Can we talk about the kris? And other objects. So, the question, of course, we're here in Groningen. How was Groningen involved in this process? Barbara Henke is my colleague from Mapping Slavery and doing this research for many years, written a book about traces of slavery in Groningen. So it's not new to Groningen to investigate these questions. But how did this project with Bitterzoet Erfgoed, who wants to answer that, Barbara?
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
Well, I'm just trying to connect. So we're here in Groningen. This question is not just, the Amsterdam or Leiden or the places like that, but here we are. This is really a national debate, a national exploration as to what do we do with the material heritage from the past. These objects, paintings, symbols, remains. Here we are now in Groningen. So I'm just interested to learn about the origins of the project, Bitter Erfgoed, what brought it together, how is it really adding to this whole debate and discussion?
About decolonizing the museums, there are multiple museums in Groningen who participate in Bitterzoet Erfgoed. And also all these museums want to look at their own collection, and so we call it Bitterzoet Erfgoed in the collectie, or bittersweet heritage in the collection. And what we do, we want members of the steering board to check out how they experience the museums and their collections, and also we try to work with experts. And then, well, actually we have this project, and during Bittersweet Heritage of Bitterzoet Erfgoed, we will apply texts in the museums on yellow boards, yellow cardboards, like a post-it, and that's the temporary description. And visitors may also participate and react, engage, and help us to make it an ongoing thing, so we can really implement it in the collection.
And the objects like the kris, what comes first? Is it someone from the descendant communities that says, hey, this object is part of my ancestral heritage and should be returned? Or is it the other way around, that this is because it's become more of a national movement to look at a material heritage in this way? What comes first? And this also could be a question for you in terms of the research. Is it from interest by the communities or from the institutions themselves, or maybe both?
So So that was Sissy. She's the project leader of Bitterzoet Erfgoed. I'm Arjen Dijkstra. I'm the director of the University Museum. We've never had a request to return anything to anywhere, and we have one of the largest collections of ethnographics in the Netherlands, outside the consortium of the Tropo Museum, or a museum for world cultures. So on that hand, it's very much a non-issue to us. On the other hand, I've been preparing for getting a request from the day I started as a director. And I've also been hoping to get one of these requests because we need to get experience with it if we want to return something, and we need to do it in a good fashion. For this, we're looking to work with groups who live in Groningen but are somehow connected to our collections because of their heritage. And the one thing I've learned over the past couple of years is that it's much, much more difficult than the way we can discuss it. There's always another layer. There's always another problem to encounter. So yes, we should have a discussion on a very high level. Do we want this? How should we organize it? But we should also be prepared to stumble upon very difficult points, I think.
Good point. I also want to make sure that the audience knows that if you have a question or burning comment, that you can just raise your hand. We have this very cool, I don't know if it's going to work, catch box. You guys know about? Oh, there's somebody there. Should we attempt to see if the catch box, does the catch box have to be turned on, or?
If you really talk into it.
Okay, I don't know if this is going to work, but we're going to try it. Some burning questions from the audience. I love technology, but I don't know if this is going to work. That's why I'm coming with the mic, too.
Does this work? Yeah.
It kind of works. What's your name?
Marius. Yes. I was wondering, like, we were talking about the university museum in this case, that they really want to receive such a request, but how do these ethnic groups or these people know where to find their colonized goods?
So the question is, how do the descendant communities or groups know where to go? So they have to, obviously, they have to have seen it in a museum, or there's the gentleman who has been going to museums throughout Europe and just taking objects. You guys heard about this guy, right?
But is it even the responsibility of the other communities to request that it's being returned? Isn't it our responsibility as a community living in this country to make an effort to really map everything that has been looted, stolen, traded, however you want to call it, in our national past and we have in our collections, and that's a heritage we have of our ancestors. And it'll take time, and it's not as simple, and it's not really black and white. There are a lot of grays in there, but I think it's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous that we're waiting for people to ask for something that they don't know the existence of, that even if you know the existence of it, like Suzanne is telling us, like that you have to look really hard and find out like who is actually the one who it should be returned to. I sometimes compare it with if you're 20 years old.
That never can be a one-way move. That only can happen if there is contact.
Yeah, you have to, but then it's our role to make the contact first and make knowledgeable that we have that object and what is the role within history or what is the place in history where it's taken from.
Yeah.
Then you can start having a conversation, right?
Yeah, that's right. Why I had asked to have a Chris as a kind of conversation piece. That is because we know so much about Chris's.
Can just for everyone know what a Chris is? Yes?
Well, let me
Just maybe briefly give a description of what it is and the context.
Yeah. A Chris is an
He's going to actually let us see it close up.
It's a dagger. It's a dagger, which is an integral part of Indonesian culture, Javanese culture, in this case, Buginese culture, and it is. You can find it everywhere in museums, in history museums, in private collections, in national collections, whatever. And so.
And its significance in terms of this colonial heritage, in particular, with the one that was recently returned to Indonesia by Prince Diponegoro, where it was discovered in the Leiden right?
It wasn't discovered.
It was always there on display.
It was always there.
Okay, but do we know anything about this Chris?
Yeah, but well, why I thought a Chris is a perfect conversation piece, because we think that we know everything. We know that it has a ritual meaning. We know that you have different Chrises, like this one is from the Bugis in Sumatra. We know that the blade is iron and that it has its pamor, and that the spirit of the Chris is actually in the pamor. We know that actually the blade is the most important part, and this can be new. So this can be 300-400 years old, and that one can be from 1920. Because what is really important is the blade. So we know a lot about those Chrises, and at the same time,
In general, right, about the Chris itself.
it is a collectible. So museums started collecting, making classifications. This is Jogja Chris, this is Boogie Chris, this is whatever. Museums started to collect in order to make their collection complete. And whereas actually these are, for families, is this heirloom. So for the soul of a family, it really belongs to them. And it is a big paradox that we know that it is heirloom of families, but we don't know the family.
Of this particular Chris, we don't have the origin.
Of most Chrises. Of course, there are some official Chrises that were donated to the royal family. So these were the Javanese rulers who gave it as a token of respect to the colonial king. That we know, but most Chrises, they are anonymous. We don't know. And when you read Itja en Adinda in Multatuli, then you can read the story of the father and the mother of Saidja, and because of the cultivation system, they suffer. So they don't have enough land anymore. They are hungry. So he has to sell his buffalo, and then, of course, he becomes even more hungry. And in the end, he also has to sell his Chris, his pusaka. So in a way, he has to sell the soul of the family. And we have thousands of Chrises in the Netherlands, and we don't know of whom they ever were. And telling the story, connecting these Chrises to the history of the cultivation system, which was forced cultivation, a kind of forced labor.
And also, but the Prince Diponegoro's Chris, for example, he was forced to abdicate it as also a symbol of surrender. So there's a lot of other layers to the narrative that sometimes gets lost in.
It wasn't a symbol of surrender. It was a symbol of being really. What is it? Verraden.
Trade.
Yeah. Because it was the Java War. So that's just before the cultivation system started in Indonesia. It was the Java War. He was the leader of the war. The Dutch couldn't win the war. In the end, they started negotiations. And during negotiations, Diponegoro was caught. His weapons were taken. He was sent into exile. And the Chris went to the Netherlands with a beautiful document which explains this is the Chris of Diponegoro. Already in 1949, so during the roundtable discussions about the Indonesian sovereignty, the recognition of Indonesian sovereignty after Indonesia had unilaterally declared itself independent in 1949, already was a request, we want back the Chris of Diponegoro. The Dutch wrote, and that's what I find in the archive, the Dutch High Commissioner wrote to the Netherlands, don't do it, because the moment you return that Chris to Sukarno, you give him the power of the Chris. So keep it in the Netherlands. So that's why I say it's not discovered.
It was known.
It was hidden.
And so that brings in line the question, of course, of how to engage with these kinds of objects and symbols and paintings, while we may not know the family of origin for this particular one.
Yeah.
You know, in your exhibitions, you're often asked, Raul, to interact with objects and paintings that have a very complex or layered or controversial history, and to use contemporary art or visual art to frame it a different way, because this is often the debate about language. So we say we'll trade with you, but if you don't trade with us, then we'll kill you for it. So there's always the question of, when we use those kinds of terms, trade, or it was a gift, give it to me or I'll kill you, is also another way that could be, if you're talking to a descendant of the history, that would say, this wasn't a gift. We didn't have a choice. So we say it's a gift, that keeps us somewhat a position of innocence. But how do you interact with this kind of conversation when you're asked to do an exhibition with controversial objects like the Gouden Koets?
Well, I think for me it makes it a lot easier to interact with objects that relate to my own cultural heritage. In case of the Chris and Indonesia, it's a bit more, it's close but a little bit farther away. My father remarried with a Moluccan lady, so it is close. It's part of my upbringing, and also the Indonesian community is really close. When we came in, I already said, oh, it's out. You shouldn't do that. Like, if we talk about how do you handle it, it's something I was brought up with. Like, you never take it out unless you use it. And all of us are not allowed to use it because it's not our Chris. So what is it even doing out in the open? Then Suzanne said, but it's presented in the right way, in the way that the knife is put up. But now you put it back, and it's the other way around. So there are a lot of things happening here in the meantime that I'm like, ooh, I hope we're not getting cursed tonight. But
because it's has a very spiritual practice in its in how it is, part of a heritage. It has very powerful symbolism as well.
Yeah, and I understand. Like, if I can take a little leap back in the conversation about human remains. Yeah. In the context of the Tropo Museum, I like that they don't want to show that, and the thinking part behind it, how this is constructed. On the other hand, when the Tropo Museum, which is the former colonial institute, says openly, like its former director said, we are going to decolonize the Tropo Institute, the only thing I can come up with is like, return everything that you have and blow up the building, please, because the building itself is so colonial. So I think we're also, like, every time sort of making excuses when we're handling these objects, because I think the Chris's, also the way you explain it, are one of the best objects within our collections that should be returned in a correct way, in a conversation with the Indonesian government, especially because you do not know to what family it belongs to.
Suzanne, do you want to
What
respond?
I wanted to say in this context is that they are orphaned.
They are what? Could you say that a little louder?
They are orphaned. So these are orphaned objects.
Well, or they are abducted.
Of course.
So should they be with the abductors?
Yeah.
This is the question. What's your name?
My name is Leeuwen. I'm a curator at the Groningen Museum. And I just wanted to say that I think that we should be careful that in decolonizing the collections, we don't reinforce certain colonial narratives. For example, if we say that everything that's traded is in a way stolen, I think we take away agency from certain people, because then we say that it was always the case that the Europeans came, saw and conquered, that it's always a asymmetric power relations. Well, in some cases that just wasn't the case. The other people in the world also were able to exert power. So I do think that we need to carefully examine traded items to see if they were traded in an asymmetrical power relation or in a more symmetrical power relation.
Okay. I guess that also, for me, invokes the thought of what does it mean to decolonize the museum? What do we really mean by that? Let's let's step back a moment and answer that question. For the museum professionals, I'm looking at you now, to see, because you're dealing with this in the Groningen Museum, what does it mean when you sit down at the table with your team, your colleagues, and say, we need to decolonize this museum?
Well, I'm Andreas Blum, director of the Groningen Museum, and actually I'm here to learn, to hear that from you, to hear that. I mean, we're talking about it. We don't have the ethnographical collection, but we have a lot of old art. We have objects that can be related to colonialism easily, sometimes not so easily. And we're looking at each object and have other people look at each object to see if there's something we're missing, describe that in the first place. In our particular case, it's not a thing of returning anything, because it's all European made.
So in the sense of decolonizing the museum, in your context, since you're not dealing directly with objects that need to be evaluated whether they'd be returned, what does it mean for your museum to decolonize itself?
Yeah. First of all,
It was just the building, huh?
First of all, awareness, learning, discussing, have other voices heard, let objects speak, and have different people interpret. I mean, we are the trustees of objects. I don't feel like the owner of the object. So the owner is the public. The public is diverse, and everybody has his or her own right to look at things and interpret things. But sometimes we need, give a little bit of assistance or ask a few questions. And the more other people help answer those questions or add new questions, the better. It's perhaps too vague for the subject, but...
You want to add to that? Oh, sorry. Yes. I'll just come to you because the little thing is way over there.
Yeah, on this question of, my name's Rachel. This question of decolonizing the museum itself was a colonial artifact. It was a creation of colonialism. So if we say, to go to your point of blowing up the building, actually, how can a museum exist if we truly decolonize it, to reverse that process? And I say that because it's not just about thinking about, what do we do with the artifacts in it, but when we talk about even being a trustee of an object, that relationship with an object or our thinking of an object comes from our thinking about colonialism, modernity, etc. So I guess my question would be to go even further back and say, do we even have museums if we decolonize?
Can I respond?
Yes, Suzanne,
or
go ahead.
maybe
You want to respond to
elaborate
them?
on that issue?
What did you say, Suzanne? Sorry.
Yeah.
Did you want to respond to the comment, or?
I would like to respond to that comment on the museum as in itself a colonial invention, because I fully agree with you, and actually it is in line with the argument that what has been collected in museums has first been turned into collectibles, like krisis, as a category that you can collect, or that you should have once you want to collect it and make your collection complete. But when you look at the Dutch museum landscape, then you will see that the Groningen Museum is art, that the University Museum is science, that the Archaeological Museum in Leiden is archaeology, that the Tropo Museum is ethnography, that the Openlucht Museum is ethnology. And in a way, that is a kind of super museum structure that repeats and confirms this classification. And natural museums are also part of it. So and that's to get back to your question about human remains. When we say we even don't know where human remains start and how it feeds into other objects, and where in the end you say, but this is man, this is object, and this is nature, that's deeply rooted in our science, in our cultural landscape. So we can start with demolishing the Tropo Museum, but then Stedelijk Museum need to be the next one.
Yes, please. No, but I say yes, please, because if I look at it from an art perspective, the whole concept of a white box and the way we look at art and how art history is built up is also a colonial matter. So it's really difficult, and I agree what you just said, that we shouldn't forget that not all power relations are a one-way street, but still the dominant factor is the Western one.
But why not struggle in all these places? Why not fight in all these places? And for instance, we had in Stedelijk Museum this exhibition on Kirche en Noorden, in which actually the work of Kirche en Noorden was put into the context of the colonial thinking of Germany between the First and the Second World War. And it ended also with pages from autobiography of Noorden that were bluntly racist. And there was one visitor, and she was so upset. And she said, all the art has been taken out of context. So, whereas the museum put the art in a certain context, for her it was taken out of context. And I think that discussion, because she wanted to see it in the context of modern art in Western Europe in the 20th century. That was what defined for her the work. And yeah, I really think that that we need to have this discussion in all museums.
Yeah, but we're in a transitional phase also, I think, as a society, or worldwide maybe. Also, when you look at the emotion and the way of impact certain thoughts, like it's a certain view people have on a certain era, right? What you described, like the visitor you now described, because we also have this art critic who was upset because an Antarctic artist, like, so there was one of the artists was a member of the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party didn't like his art, so he was Antarctic, which meant that the art that he made was not for Nazis approved. And then he fought because he was a Nazi, so he wanted to be approved by the Nazi regime. And now the problem the art critic had with this particular show, that through this show and putting his work in this context of colonialism, that we Antarcted, if I said it correct in German, Antarcted the artist again. And that's a point where you lost.
So the danger of reproducing the violence in which you're trying to...
Even within the emotions we have, within recent history, there's a Nazi who's not accepted for being a Nazi, and now we make him an unaccepted Nazi again while he wanted to be a Nazi. I'm like, why do we even care about this part of the whole history?
Let's get some more discussion.
Yeah, by the way, I really like that exhibition very much. Oh, do I need to introduce myself? I'm Barbara Henkes, historian here at the university. And I did like this exhibition very much because we really got a new perspective on these artists and their work. And it made me look also in the collection of the Groninger Museum in the Ploeg. I really saw new ways of looking at these paintings. And that is what we tried with Decolonizing the Groninger Museum. We really looked at what we had and tried to find a new perspective on what we saw and what we did not see or what we did not know. So we used these old paintings, 18th century paintings, with the zwarte bedienden, black servants, and we invited Van Basharif to use his imagination, the author Van Basharif, to give these persons who are anonymous an identity and a story. But not only that, also in the what Andreas already said, we tried to look at the study stuff which is there and try to find different stories to add to what is there. And another example of that was I did see before in the Amsterdam Museum with the collection of the so-called Gouden Eeuw at the time. And there was also these interventions so that you saw the same pictures, but you saw them in a different way.
Is that what it means for decolonizing museums?
Well, indeed, for the collection, which is now there, and of course, it's also important to think about collecting and a new way of collecting, but that's the next step.
One of the dangers, before I come to you for the question, is you have a question online? Okay. One of the dangers of this idea of decolonizing that I've found in recent years is there is, and someone may have mentioned it, a danger of reproducing a new form of violence. Because a really bad example, good example, is the Royal Museum in Tervuren. Has anyone been there, the before and after? The before was pretty graphic, clearly a colonial museum, collections from Leopold's, his exploits and exploitations. But then they tried to revamp the whole thing and make it more contemporary. It got worse, in my opinion. I don't know if anybody would agree with me, where they moved all of the so-called objects that were being contested into this sort of warehouse area. Now they're all housed together. And then they put in some dioramas and new technology. And now I'm confused when I go there. I don't know what they are, what their identity is. So there's the danger of going about the process of trying to decolonize the museum. And in a sense, you erase history instead of recontextualizing it. So I don't know if you had a different comment or question, but this is something I want us to think about as well. See, it evokes some thought.
Well, perhaps my comment now is a bit like too late, but before we blow up all the museums, I want to make one last plea. I mean, museums, of course, a Western concept, but they were born from Enlightenment, 18th century, taking objects out of context, in that case of churches and palaces, from the people of power and to give it to the people. That's like the idea of the British Museum and the Louvre. So before we blow it all up, it wasn't all bad.
As a part of nation building.
Do you want to
do we want to go into nation building and enlightenment? That's fine.
You're going to really throw it? This is how it works. Well, good luck with that. Oh, there we go. So, introduce yourself.
This one?
No, the others, yeah.
My name is Willem. I'm also a master.
I don't hear him. Do you hear him?
All right. This is better? All right. My name is Willem. I'm from Groningen, and I'm doing also a master cultural history. And I just wanted to add something to what you said about reproducing colonialism. Yeah. Is that if you are talking about decolonizing the museum, you also have to look at your partners who are sponsoring your museum and that are deeply rooted in colonialism, are deeply still being colonizing, still, so that was my point. So it's not just your collection, it's also your sponsorship.
Very good point. And I have an example. I was just in South Africa a few months ago, and there's a lot of debate around material heritage, monuments, etc. Courtois, who is a very controversial figure that was very much involved in the Dutch colonial period, in terms of her memory, and there are institutions that still uphold the VOC mentality, that they have plaques on the ground where they put new beautiful gold inlaid VOC, the Wapen is there. There's the VOC company's garden where you go into the cafe, they're still wearing their VOC aprons, and you're like, what the is going on? And we had a meeting with Dutch Culture, because there is actually the Institute, and Dutch Culture is listed as a sponsor. Oh my God. So we asked the Consul General, did you know that Dutch Culture and the Consul is one of the sponsors of this whole beautification of the VOC? And he was completely like, oh, no way. I said, here it is. So it's a very important point you're making, that institutions and their partners also have a responsibility to understand what they're signing up for, what they're supporting. And there's a lot of requests, and things sometimes can get overlooked. But this is a very good point in terms of the network that is what you're raising. Okay, there was here, and then online there's a question, and someone over there had a question.
All right, so there's one thing that's really important and we shouldn't step over. If I want to re-buy my collection, the collection I have now as a university museum, I can go on KataWiki, and I think if you give me 10,000 euros, I can buy almost half my collection for no money at all on KataWiki. If we're really honest, we don't really care as a society. It's here. I would love to return it before somebody requests it, but I don't have the money to do it. I don't have the people to do it, and nobody will give me that money to do that, right? So it's because on some level we don't care, or we don't care enough. And we, as a broad society, right? Like the people here and the people listening at home, you probably care as much as I do. But if we look at this from a bigger point of view, we don't. And we do need the money, the commitment, and the only way to raise that commitment is by creating real engagement. And I'm not meaning like a group of people who want to come and demonstrate and have a good time and stuff like that, but I'm talking about real commitment in the long term. And I think the only way to properly do that is through great exhibitions and obviously good books and good stories about it, but we don't want to blow it up just yet. We need to create
the building is not going anywhere. I have another suggestion also what might help is politically vote for different political parties. That would help a lot to get some budget raised.
Applause for that.
So I'm Anne Beaulieu. I'm professor of knowledge infrastructures at Campus Friesland at the University of Groningen. And I'd like to put forward an alternative framing that hasn't come up yet, and that is indigenizing the museum or finding... Well, let me give the example. In Winnipeg, in Canada, Museum Kumayat, which has really rethought its categorization of artifacts, has brought in curators who are from the Inuit culture, who has renamed all the spaces and really redesigned what it means to visit a museum. So, for example, the collection of Inuit sculptures are in glass cases so that they're much more accessible than the usual collections that are put away, so that artists can come and be inspired, people can find their families, because the artifacts are also displayed according to families as opposed to, these more art historical categories. So I'm wondering whether that might also be an approach.
Can I
both
just
want to respond?
Go ahead, Raul.
Well, Canada and most American states from the north to the south are settler states and actually still colonies. The objects you talk about are in their native country. If we want to have an indigenous museum over here, we're going back to the Germanic people. I mean, this is totally different. Yeah, I think if you ask me about Northern America, I think if we are really honest about it, that we should take all the Europeans back to Europe and then let the indigenous people decide how they want to rule their own countries for the first time since 500 years. Or, well, when you look at migration of the West, it's actually 150 and 200. But this is a way we think about the West still. That is a really colonized way of thinking of who lives where. If you ask a young kid at a school, so what is an American? They draw a fat white dude with a cowboy hat.
But yeah. So whenever I've heard people speaking about that particular art space, that has also been integrated as part of the language of talking about spaces as being part of treaties or non-ceded land. Yeah, I mean, as a acknowledgement that is made very systematically.
Yeah, well,
For me, a space that you're referring would be like the Black Archives. That is indigenized space that really claims its heritage, that uses collections to tell different stories, its own stories. I get what you're saying, that I don't know that in the full concept of what you're talking about would work in the Netherlands per se. And maybe Suzanne, do you have a different spin on?
yeah, well, actually, indeed, it's important to understand the difference between settler colonies, where the first people actually became minorities in their own country. In that context, and then there's a huge difference with the kind of colonialism of the Netherlands, which was exploiting countries somewhere else, and in which everybody, in a way, was anonymous for the colonizer and stays anonymous. When knowledge about contemporary Indonesia in the Netherlands, it's a disaster. The Basiab discussion or whatever. So it remains a country far away where we have some legacies. But of course, if we understand the Netherlands as an immigration country, where not that there is an original Dutch, and so we are still discussing nation formation. When we acknowledge that the Netherlands are an immigration country for centuries, then also the whole idea of to whom belongs this, and what is the culture of others, and what is our culture, like you say, this is also my culture. Mm-hmm. That whole understanding is also something that now gradually is changing. So for me, decolonizing the museum is not a moment, but it's a movement.
But I think what is even I don't know if it's easier, but what I think is really weird when we talk about Dutch context, that we don't even, as living in this part of the kingdom, have any clear knowledge of the ABC and the SSS islands. And some of them are municipalities within this kingdom. Why is that not on our national news in every evening, what happens on all the islands? Just after we have Woerden, Groningen, and we have news about strikes on the train or the police, and then you have what happened on Aruba. Why is that not there? I mean, if we talk about still colonized parts of this kingdom, it's not part of our national notion living in this part of the kingdom. And I think that's already a start of reflecting on how colonized all of our minds still are.
Let's hold that thought and
Yeah.
online for...
So now I have this person behind me that has been wanting to ask a question for ages. No, it's no problem.
Can you all hear me? Good? Yeah. My name is Millie, and I had a question about like the remains of peoples, indigenous and slaves. For me, as a descendant of slaves, I feel like how could you think about keeping it at all? Because, you know, it was that person's body and they should have autonomy over what happens to it, and they can't say anything anymore. So I feel like those parts of those people need to be put to rest. In their countries of origin, I just don't see how there could be like any question about that. Yeah.
Well, I think that you perfectly explain why the project is pressing matter. Because of course that's the question. That's the key question. That official report said, okay, we do have to restitute it. We should not keep it. But that's only a political statement that in itself is empty if you don't know how to do that. It is urgent, I agree.
Before I come back to you, there is a question from our online audience. Is there space in Pressing Matters for research on the somatic heritage of slavery and on the embodied experience of walking through an exhibition on slavery and on the museum as supporting healing as a process?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. And indeed, we have one of our sub-projects is about what we call reconciliation, healing, with artists, but also not only
Not
with...
this one.
No, not only with... No, it's an open call for all over the world. But we will also have exhibition experiments, what we call, or exhibition labs, what we call. And that's exactly in order to try to think about this. And this whole notion of the embodied experience of walking through an exhibition, that's really well phrased, because that is what happens. It is not easy to go and watch this, and the ethics are not always clear. And the care after having visited such an exhibition, or to know whether you had a say in how it was presented, or I'm always thinking of Victor Kasiepo. He was in Papua, and he passed away, but he was working with us on the human remains in the Tropo Museum, and he said, you know, with all the knowledge that you have, when you come to Papua and you tell this, it will be like a tsunami, and the people will be just blown away, because they don't know that there is so many in your museums related to their ancestors. So really think about how to inform people. And exhibitions can be a way to do that, but as I understand the intervention, online intervention, it can also be very painful for people.
And isn't there also, we're speaking of just the remains that they're there, but Petrus Kamper, who conducted scientific experiments on black bodies, people from Angola, from different places, those remains are also included in this research. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think this is for me. We indeed have the collections of Petrus Kamper here in Groningen. Petrus Kamper was a professor in medicine, a researcher in medicine, who looked at how people developed over time, how people differed from what he called how people differed who were from different races, as he saw it. He was also one of the first, let me put this in another way, one of the most powerful, well, it's not objects, it's human remains we have on display currently in the museum, comes from the collection Petrus Kamper. It's 2 pieces of skin. The one piece is from a white person, the other piece of skin is from a colored person. Petrus Kamper peeled off the first couple of layers of these pieces of skin, and he concluded color is only skin deep. He didn't use the phrase that was so popular in the 90s, but it almost literally says that. Whenever I show this to children of the age of 14, 15 years old, it's a very, very powerful message. It's not something I could replicate in any other way. It's been in the museum when I became a director. It's still there. It's in between many other pieces of human remains from all over the world. And I'm hesitant to take it out because I see the powerful image here. And I don't know, nobody knows where these pieces of skin come from. So we could put it to rest in the Netherlands or something like that. But we would also destroy a piece of history that's very important for the realization. He was one of the first people to conclude that black and white people don't differ at the core. So it's also something we actually may not want to lose, right? So these are the difficult questions we're faced with, actually.
It brings up another important point about power relation, right? Because while Petrus Kamper's findings, as I know it, did not prove that there were no real biological differences, that's not necessarily what got produced as knowledge. And what influenced generations later, the eugenics and anthropology and scientific racism. So the question about how do we treat this colonial past, I think is really still up for a lot of debate, because what can happen as a result, while it has a very powerful teaching potential, we talked about pain and also memory. What does it mean? How can we use this knowledge to heal the past, but also to reconcile, to repatriation, reparation? All of these come into question, I'm sure, in your research project as well, Suzanne. And did you want to add something?
I'm sorry, I'm Sharon Doelwijd, and I have a theater here in the city, and I'm a jazz vocalist. So I make programs about Kitty Kotti, about actually being different. But the whole evening I've been sitting here and listening to all kinds of things and blowing up museums and how skin color, or how colored people are, that it's just only skin deep. And actually what we are talking about now is decolonizing the world. Because how can we justify the fact that we have a museum where people put things, where they took them from other people and think that that is art? We can only use things to study and see how the world works. But in fact, what we all are doing here, what the Bitterzoet heritage thing is about, or Bitterzoet Erfgoed, is about decolonizing the world. And yes, indeed, everybody has different DNA strains going through their bodies, and not just because you are colored that you have them, but also people that are completely white have different patterns in their system. So we have to go way back, and understand that Cleopatra was not a white woman.
I think that the notion of decolonizing the world is nice, but that also feels somewhat like we're saying, let's boil the ocean. It's the challenge with it is we have to start.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like a start, because you have to. It's not just one part. It's
All connected. Yeah. Absolutely, and you're right, because as I travel to South Africa, the links to Suriname and the Caribbean and North were so very deeply rooted. Even blackface in South Africa is connected to the minstrel shows that traveled from the U.S. Across the water. So this is a very important point. All right, we're down to a few minutes before you intersect, because we have 5 minutes. There was one other question which I lost again online, and then I want to give each of you a chance to sort of bring it together before we close. It says, I was missing in the previous topic of whom and what institutions should really return exactly. Can we be more specific? Exactly, rather than remain in general terms, how should this infrastructure really look? Let's get down to details. Be specific.
3 minutes now.
3 minutes you have 2 minutes to give that answer.
Well, actually, I do know which institutions do want to return. And of course, the ethnographic museums, they agree that they are going to return. So they want it. Then the Rijksmuseum, National Museum, in a way is in between wanting, but also having very much doubt, etc., and having a special problem that part of their collection that might really qualify for return is not theirs, but is only on display in the Rijksmuseum. So that's the Vereniging van Vrienden van Aziatische Kunst. And that's really something that Borobudur had. I don't know what else.
So, and would an institution submit to you your project request saying, hey, this is an object, these are objects that we are considering, can we get your support in exploring?
The institutions that collaborate in our project all are ready to return. But actually what we also want to do is find mechanisms to get away from having to do all the research on each object one by one, because in a way that is an encyclopedic reconstruction of imperialism. So we are using computer science, for instance, to find out whether we can also make new classifications that would allow to restitute classes of objects, like Benin bronzes, which in a way is an easy example. But, well, as you say, you take all the Christus and bring them back. So we are also thinking about how can we scale up, because we are really talking about more than 1 million objects.
Thank you, Suzanne. In 2 minutes, you did great. Raul, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add something. I like the example of Kamper, because I think what you just did is a good example of what we should stop doing. Kamper, in my experience and how I read Kamper, he's one of the founders of scientific racism. He does skull measurements or the drawings where there are comparisons to be made between black people and monkeys. And I think that if we want to explain to a group of kids that color only goes skin deep, that this is not the person to use. I think we can move away from those kind of discourses or people who were part in this historical era by now, informing this racist ideology, though they didn't do it all themselves, I know, and it's part of the development of racism. But we can do better. I think there's no reason why that is the key object to explain this to kids. I don't think that's
So on
necessary.
that note, before, as we come to the conclusion, Raul, in your work as a curator, contemporary artist, interacting with these kinds of objects, what do you see the future for the past? What do you see, what way forward do you see in decolonizing the museum movement? What do you think we need to be thinking about?
Well, I agree partially with wondering if we can really decolonize museums. I think that's a really difficult thing to do, especially also because, like I said about the ABC Islands and SSS Islands, how we look at that thing about nationality, we are all still really colonized in our own minds. Also us thinking really critical about it, have this problem because we grew up in this system. But I would hope that we could come to a place which is easier explained by talking about street names. When do we get at a point when we think about street names and renaming street names that we just want a clear start? That we just want to have a clean slate and start calling or naming streets by emotions or beautiful flowers, and we take out the persons. Also, do not add new persons. Like if we would have had a Michael Jackson street right now, then we also would have a problem. I mean, let's be imaginative.
There's no clean slate in history.
I don't know. If we are decolonized, if we are all decolonized, do we need to repeat this history every time in the other detail that we are doing right now as a movement?
I fully agree with that. I think that the moment you change the name of a street, in Amsterdam we changed the Stalinallee into the Vrijheidslaan. Mm-hmm. Everybody with some historical understanding still knows that it was the Stalinallee and why it was changed into Vrijheidslaan. That's part of our historical understanding. So the moment you change, we have the Steve Biko-plein in the Sorry.
No, it's okay. This is when at the end is when we get into the real deep debate. 5 more minutes, Jen. 5 more minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So there's the Pretoriastraat, and in the middle of the Pretoriastraat is the Steve Biko-plein. We know why it is mentioned Steve Biko-plein in the middle of this neighborhood of the Transvaalbuurt. So that's part of our historical understanding, and so changing names is very important, but it's never a clean slate.
No, because when I think it's a really good example, because we changed the Stalinland,
but now
but we still have Churchillan, who was also a mass murderer, when we look at the Bengal famine. So this is the selectiveness we have, which comes back in a way.
Yeah, but then we are going to campaign to change the Churchillan.
No, but just change all.
Sorry to interrupt. This is for the next conversation. But I don't want to leave. I don't want us to leave without. Did I get cut off? Am I still here? Without at least also announcing about the exhibition that's coming up with Bitterzoet Erfgoed. It is opening officially Friday. Am I right? The 18th of February on Friday at the Forum Groningen. And it will be a talk show, broadcast live. It will be opened by the mayor of the municipality, is that correct? And the deputy province of Groningen also. The talk show will be hosted by Jerry Silvano. There will be exhibition and city walk. This all can be found online on the website. I'm looking to the team over there. There's one of the projects is a close light on the past, art in a kerk. Also, traces of the colonial past, Black in Groningen. So please do go online to find out about the programming. And thank you all for just being present and a part of this. Jennifer, my co-Jennifer, for organizing this, for inviting me to be your host. For our panel, Raul and Suzanne, thank you very much for the engaging conversation. And all of you online as well, thank you. And we really appreciate. Hope you come back again soon. Any last word? Yes, and an applause. Do you want to make any announcements? No, that's it? Well, I don't know how fast we have to move out of the building, but let's hope we can continue a little bit of this conversation because it was just getting good. Thank you all again. Good night.